Darkness. A quiet cemetery. A name whispered by decades of unanswered questions. You are watching Disturbed Intent. Before we begin, take a moment to like this video, leave a thoughtful comment, and hit the subscribe button so you never miss any of our deep dive true crime investigations. Your engagement helps more stories like this reach the light. Now, let's go back to the beginning, to a summer morning that changed American forensic history forever. It was the summer of 1982, and the small town of Blairstown, New Jersey, was quiet in a way that only rural American towns can be. Nestled among tall trees, rolling hills, and winding roads, the town's cemetery, Cedar Ridge, was a place where silence felt natural. It was where people came to remember, not to fear. But on a warm morning in mid-July, something disrupted that peace. Something violent. Something that would erase a young girl's identity for 40 years. A caretaker walking his usual rounds noticed something unusual near a wooded section of the cemetery grounds. At first glance, he thought it might have been discarded clothing or perhaps debris washed in from the nearby road after a recent rainfall. But as he stepped closer, the truth hit him with a force that left him shaken. There, lying near the tree line, was the body of a teenage girl. She was young, she was alone, and she was unrecognizable. Her face had been so severely injured that it prevented anyone from knowing who she was. There were no distinguishing documents, no purse, no wallet, no jewelry, no identifying objects of any kind. The caretaker immediately called law enforcement. Within minutes, squad cars rolled into the cemetery, their presence shattering the stillness as yellow caution tape went up around the scene. Officers moved carefully, understanding that every detail mattered. That morning, unknown to everyone involved, marked the beginning of one of the most haunting mysteries in American forensic history. As investigators surveyed the scene, the first question was immediate. Who was she? She appeared to be a teenager, perhaps 14, perhaps 18, somewhere in the fragile, in-between years when childhood is fading but adulthood has not yet begun. Her clothing offered only limited clues. She had been dressed in a bright-colored, patterned blouse, and clear nail polish remained on her fingers, details suggesting she cared about her appearance, perhaps preparing for something or someone. But the lack of any personal belongings created a void that investigators struggled to fill. They studied the position of her body, the direction of her injuries, and the disruption around the grass and dirt. Everything indicated she had not died there. She had been brought to the cemetery. The violence she endured was severe, but in this retelling, because this is Disturbed Intent and we remain ads-friendly, we will avoid graphic detail. Instead, we focus on the investigative reality. Her face was injured to the point that visual identification was impossible. Police were instantly aware of what this meant. Without a recognizable face and without identification, the challenge of learning her name increased dramatically. That was the moment someone no one knows exactly who first said it referred to her as Princess Doe. A name chosen because she was found near a cemetery. A name chosen because she deserved dignity. A name chosen because they hoped that one day someone would recognize her. The name would remain with her for 4 decades. Word spread quickly through Blairstown, as small-town news always does. By midday, residents gathered in small groups around porches, storefronts, and quiet roadsides, talking in hushed tones. Who was the girl? Where had she come from? How could something so violent happen in such a peaceful place? Local newspapers printed front-page stories with sketches of what she might have looked like. Artists attempted facial reconstructions, working from what remained. The police reached out across New Jersey and neighboring states. Has anyone reported a missing teenager? Has anyone not come home? Does anyone recognize this girl? But no one stepped forward. Weeks passed, then months, then years. Children who grew up hearing about Princess Doe left town, started families of their own, and returned as adults, only to find the case unchanged. The cemetery still held a grave marked not with a name, but with a title. Princess Doe, Unknown Girl, found July 19, 1982. Her case became woven into the identity of Blairstown. She became a part of the community, even though no one knew who she was. Technology in the early 1980s lacked the tools investigators needed. DNA testing was barely emerging. Genealogy did not exist. Databases for missing persons were limited. Facial reconstruction methods were primitive. Detectives did everything they could. They checked runaway shelters as. They combed through missing teen reports. They examined bus station records. They consulted with out-of-state departments. They interviewed known offenders. They re-examined old tips for years. But nothing connected. One detective who would later speak about the case said something that echoed the heartbreak of everyone involved. "We had everything, except her identity." The physical evidence was limited. Her clothing revealed little. Her injuries prevented traditional identification. Her story seemed trapped behind a wall of silence. By the late 1980s, as DNA technology improved, investigators attempted to extract genetic material. But the results were too limited to identify her. Still, the case remained open. Blairstown refused to forget her. It is easy, in true crime cases, to focus only on the puzzle pieces, the forensics, the timeline, the evidence. But Princess Doe was a real person. Someone loved her once. Someone raised her. Someone expected her to walk through a door that she never returned through. In the decades after her discovery, people placed flowers on her grave. School classes visited to learn about empathy and justice. Local residents ensured her site was maintained. She was gone, but she was not abandoned. Her story became a reminder of how many unidentified victims exist, how many families live with unanswered questions and empty chairs at their tables. Princess Doe symbolized all of them. She became a national case, drawing attention from media outlets, true crime programs, and forensic researchers. But despite the recognition, her true identity continued to evade everyone. As the 1990s passed, new detectives inherited the case. They reviewed old reports. They re-examined the cemetery site. They re-interviewed surviving parties. New theories emerged. Was she a runaway? A victim of trafficking? A teenager who crossed paths with the wrong person? Someone whose family never reported her missing? No theory fully matched the evidence. Her case remained one of the oldest unsolved identity mysteries in the country. Then, as the 21st century began, new forensic technologies exploded into relevance. Mitochondrial DNA, STR profiling, advanced facial reconstruction, national DNA databases, genetic genealogy. Each advancement brought hope. Each advancement brought new attempts. But each attempt, for years, ended the same way. No match. Princess Doe remained without a name. In the late 2010s, investigators began exploring the field of forensic genealogy, a groundbreaking method that had already solved decades-old cases by linking crime scene DNA to distant relatives in public genealogical databases. It was a method built on patience, science, and the determination to give victims back their names. In Blairstown, this sparked renewed energy. If they could obtain a clean DNA sample from Princess Doe, perhaps her identity could finally be uncovered. But they needed something durable, something untouched, something that carried her genetic code without contamination. That's when forensic experts turned to one of the most reliable sources of ancient DNA, a molar tooth. Inside a tooth protected by enamel and shielded from environmental degradation, DNA often survives for decades. In the year 2022, nearly 40 years after she was found, experts successfully extracted a high-quality DNA profile from one of her molars. It was a scientific moment, decades in the making. And the results would change everything. Through genealogical mapping, comparing her DNA to distant relatives, investigators built a family tree. Names emerged, connections formed, branches narrowed, and then a match. For the first time in 40 years, Princess Doe had a name, Dawn Olanick, a teenager from Long Island, a young woman whose life had been cut short far from home, a daughter who had been missing for decades. Her family, after so many years, finally learned the truth. It was a moment of closure mixed with heartbreak. Answers? Yes, but answers filled with sorrow. With her identity confirmed, investigators pushed toward the next question. Who killed her? Through renewed investigative work, long-held suspicions pointed toward a man named Arthur Kinella, a known violent offender with ties to New Jersey. Information surfaced linking him to Dawn and to violent behavior during that era. Although he could no longer be prosecuted due to circumstances outside the scope of this monetization-safe retelling, law enforcement publicly named him as the person responsible for her death. It took 40 years. But at last, both her identity and her killer were known. Princess Doe's story had come full circle. The story of Princess Doe did not fade with time. Instead, it grew into something larger, something heavier. A mystery that stretched across decades and settled itself into the consciousness of everyone who had ever heard her name. In the years after her discovery in the summer of 1982, she became a kind of silent presence in Blairstown, a reminder of a life interrupted and a question that refused to be answered. Even as the seasons changed, even as new families moved into town and others moved away, her presence remained like an echo that never stopped repeating. Investigators who inherited her case over the years spoke of her as though she were someone they had once known, someone whose story they felt responsible for finishing. They read old reports until the pages softened, revisited the cemetery at dawn and dusk, and studied every detail of the clothing she had been wearing on the day she was found. They carried her memory with them, and when they retired, the case transferred to new hands with new determination. Every detective understood the weight of it. Every detective knew that forgetting her was not an option. Technology had not yet caught up with the mystery. Through the 1980s and 1990s, forensic science advanced, but not fast enough to build a clear path to her identity. Missing persons databases improved, though not enough to link her to any family searching for a daughter who had disappeared. Facial reconstruction became more refined, and yet her injuries made even the most skilled artists hesitant to guess. Everything about her case seemed to resist resolution. And as time passed, the world around her grave continued to evolve. New roads were built, new homes rose from old fields. Children who had once passed her grave while riding bicycles grew into adults who brought their own children to lay flowers for the girl who still had no name. Some people left handwritten notes, not knowing who they were writing to, only knowing that someone should speak to her. Others left small trinkets, tiny angels, bracelets, folded paper stars, symbols of remembrance from strangers who felt connected to her despite never knowing her face. When the 2000s arrived, Princess Doe's case took on a new dimension. The internet brought her story to a much wider audience. Online forums discussed her in detail. Amateur investigators built timelines and shared theories, analyzing every clue that had been publicly released. For many, she became the most haunting unidentified victim in America. People from different states, people who had never heard of Blairstown, people who had never set foot in New Jersey, all became emotionally invested in her story. They wanted to give her the one thing she had been denied for so long, the truth of her name. Despite the attention, real answers still refused to surface. New missing persons cases were compared to her, new DNA tools were tested, new interviews were conducted, but nothing seemed to penetrate the wall of uncertainty that had built itself around her identity. Detectives spoke about moments when hope suddenly seemed within reach, when a reported runaway matched her age range, or when a family claimed to have once known a girl who vanished around the same time. Yet every lead eventually dissolved. Every promising angle collapsed under scrutiny. What kept her case alive, more than anything, was persistence. The belief that even the coldest case could be warmed by time and effort. The belief that someone, somewhere, must have known her. And the belief that no victim should be left unidentified, especially not one so young. Years passed. The world changed again. Digital records expanded, genetic databases grew, and the science behind DNA identification reached levels that once seemed impossible. Cases once thought unsolvable began unraveling one by one. Families received answers after waiting 20 or 30 or even 40 years. And in the quiet corners of New Jersey, Princess Doe's case stood waiting, as though history had paused her story long enough for science to finally catch up. It was the early 2020s when the renewed momentum truly began. Law enforcement agencies revisited old unidentified remains cases, recognizing that each one had the potential to be solved through forensic genealogy. When Princess Doe's file resurfaced, the possibility felt different this time. Not like a hope, but like a calling. Experts examined the preserved evidence and concluded that the most reliable source of surviving DNA would likely come from one of her teeth, protected for decades by the shield of enamel. The moment was delicate, almost solemn. After 40 years of waiting, investigators extracted DNA from her molar, handling the evidence with the respect of someone holding a fragile key to a locked door. What came next was slow, meticulous, and deeply scientific. Her DNA was compared to genealogical databases in hopes of finding relatives, distant cousins, great-grandparents, anyone genetically connected to her. Weeks turned into months as researchers built a family tree from fragments of DNA similarities. It was like assembling a puzzle without the box, a puzzle of hundreds of years, dozens of branches, countless lives intertwining through history. Each genetic match provided another clue, and each clue led to another branch. When a breakthrough happened, it did not happen suddenly, but gradually, piece by piece, until one name began to rise above all others. Dawn Olanick, a teenager from Long Island, a girl whose disappearance had gone unsolved at the time, whose absence had been felt deeply by those who knew her, and whose life had ended far from the place she called home. When investigators confirmed her identity, it was the kind of moment that leaves even seasoned professionals quiet. Princess Doe, after 40 years, finally had a name. For nearly half a century, she had been a symbol of the unidentified, a lingering question that stretched across generations. Now, she was someone real again. Someone with a story. Someone who had lived, laughed, and belonged to a family who had wondered what became of her. Her identity changed her from a symbol back into a person. When her name was announced publicly, the reaction was immediate and emotional. People who had followed her case for years found themselves unexpectedly moved. This girl they had known only through sketches and reconstructions now felt suddenly human. Dawn was no longer an abstract figure in a cold case. She was a daughter whose life had been stolen. With her identity confirmed, investigators turned their focus toward the one question that had always hovered in the shadows. Who had taken her life? Over the years, numerous suspects had been considered, but evidence remained elusive. Old statements resurfaced. Old interviews were re-examined. Old connections were mapped again under the light of new information. As they revisited past leads, one name stood out: Arthur Kinella, a man known for violence, whose criminal history aligned with the era and the geography, and whose behavior raised red flags that could no longer be ignored. His name had surfaced before, back in earlier decades, but had never been fully pursued. Now, with modern context and Dawn's identity providing new direction, investigators connected details that had once seemed unrelated. Kinella's involvement became clear enough that authorities felt confident naming him as the person responsible for Dawn Olanick's death. The announcement did not erase the decades of mystery, but it brought something long overdue: resolution. Dawn's story, once defined by silence, now carried truth. The truth of who she was, the truth of what happened, the truth of who ended her life. And though justice could not be carried out in the traditional sense, the acknowledgement mattered. It mattered for her family. It mattered for the investigators, who never stopped trying. It mattered for the community that adopted her memory. And it mattered for every person who believed that her story deserved an ending. As her case reached this long-awaited turning point, a deeper truth revealed itself, one that often becomes clear only in stories like this. Even when answers seem unreachable, even when decades pass without clarity, and even when hope flickers low, the pursuit of truth remains powerful. For 40 years, Dawn was known only as Princess Doe. For 40 years, people said her name without knowing her real one. For 40 years, she lingered between memory and mystery, and yet she was never forgotten. Her identity resurfaced because people cared, because science advanced, because persistence outlasted silence, and because the belief that every person matters, every name, every story never faded. And as we move into the next part of this documentary, we explore not only how investigators confirmed the identity of her killer, but how Dawn's story transformed the world of forensic genealogy, reshaped how unidentified victims are approached, and became one of the most significant breakthroughs in cold case history. Before we continue, remember to support the channel that brings these stories to light. If you haven't already, take a second to like this video, leave a thoughtful comment, and hit the subscribe button. Your support helps us uncover more stories that deserve to be told. In the aftermath of Dawn Olanick's identification, something shifted not just for the investigators who had carried her file for decades, but for the entire culture of cold case work. Her story, once anchored to uncertainty, now moved with purpose. The confirmation of her name had opened a door that had remained shut for nearly 40 years, and behind that door lay the larger truth of what happened to her. It was a moment that forced every person involved to revisit the past with fresh eyes and renewed urgency. Forensic genealogy had not only given Dawn back her identity, it had also provided a path forward. Investigators could trace the threads of her life, where she grew up, who she knew, where she had been before that terrible summer day, and who might have crossed her path. What once felt like a case suspended in midair now had weight, grounding, and direction. The silence around her story began to crack as facts emerged from old shadows. To understand the significance of this moment, it helps to imagine the investigators who had lived with her case for years. Many of them had remained connected to it long after retiring, still checking in, still hoping for something, anything that could reveal her identity. When the call came that she had finally been named, some of those investigators reportedly felt a wave of emotion that had been building for half a lifetime. Her case had become part of their careers, part of their personal history, and part of the promise they had made to themselves never to let her be forgotten. Families of missing children often speak about the agony of not knowing, the constant loop of questions that never quiets. Dawn's family lived with that weight for years, without answers. When they learned what had become of her, the grief resurfaced, not new grief, but grief that had been waiting in a quiet corner of their lives since the moment she disappeared. And yet, woven into that grief was something deeply meaningful: the truth. At long last, someone had cared enough to bring Dawn home. With her identity confirmed, the next step was reconstructing the timeline leading up to her death. Investigators wanted to know where Dawn had been in the days, weeks, and possibly months before she was found in Blairstown. They began contacting individuals who might have known her, those who might have seen or spoken to her around the period she disappeared. Old friends, extended family, community members, anyone who could shed light on the final chapter of her life. They learned that Dawn was like many teenagers, navigating the complexities of adolescence. She had her own dreams, her own emotions, her own struggles, but nothing in her life story suggested that she was destined for violence. Nothing in the accounts of those who knew her pointed to a reason she should have ended up in a remote New Jersey cemetery. It was clear that the responsibility for what happened to her lay entirely with the person who crossed her path at the wrong moment. As investigators sorted through the new information, the name that kept resurfacing was Arthur Kinella. Over the years, he had been linked to various crimes, the kind of man whose presence in any investigation raised suspicions. His history was marked by violence and unpredictability, and authorities began re-examining the possibility that he had crossed paths with Dawn around the time she vanished. It is important to keep this retelling fully monetization safe, so we avoid graphic descriptions. Instead, we focus on the investigative reality. Kinella was not a stranger to law enforcement. He had a record that stretched back decades, with incidents revealing a pattern of aggression and volatility. As investigators combed through older files, interviews, and notes, the pieces began forming a pattern that was difficult to ignore. When authorities publicly named him as the individual responsible for Dawn's death, they did so with confidence, rooted in re-evaluated evidence, historical context, and connections that only emerged once Dawn's identity was known. It was not a rushed conclusion, nor was it based on speculation. It was the product of years of work reinterpreted through the lens of modern understanding. But naming her killer was only one part of the story. The larger impact of Dawn's case reached far beyond that conclusion. Her identification represented a turning point, a moment when forensic science proved once again that time alone could not bury the truth. Cases long thought impossible to solve now had a pathway forward. Families who had waited decades for answers began approaching law enforcement with renewed hope. Investigators across the country looked at their unidentified remains cases with fresh determination, knowing that what had been done for Dawn could potentially be done for others. Her story became a case study in persistence, the kind of narrative taught in forensic programs and referenced in conferences about cold case methodology. She symbolized what could happen when new technology meets unwavering dedication. In many ways, Dawn's case helped push forensic genealogy into mainstream crime solving. It encouraged more departments to submit DNA from long unidentified remains, even when the evidence seemed fragile or degraded. It prompted new partnerships between law enforcement agencies and private genetic research organizations. It inspired grant programs aimed at funding DNA extraction, re-extraction, and genealogical analysis. Her story sparked discussions about how many unidentified victims still remain in the United States and what could be done to help identify them. But while the scientific breakthroughs were remarkable, the emotional heart of the case never faded. Dawn's identity was not just an answer on a report, it was a reminder of the humanity behind every cold case file. She was more than a victim. She was a person with a real story, a real identity, and a real-life one that was cut short far too soon. Her existence was no longer defined solely by the moment she was found. She was once again defined by the years she lived before that moment. The discovery of her name also changed how the community of Blairstown viewed her grave. For nearly 40 years, Princess Doe had been buried with a name given to her by strangers who loved her without knowing her. Now she had her true name, a name that belonged to her and her alone. The gravestone that carried the title Princess Doe now stood as a symbol of both mystery and resolution. It represented the decades she spent unidentified, but it also represented the commitment that eventually led to her being found. And even though many residents felt a bittersweet connection to the old name, they embraced the truth of who she really was. They understood that Princess Doe was never meant to be a permanent identity, she was meant to be Dawn. They honored her nonetheless, recognizing that the title Princess Doe had been born out of care, not carelessness. It had been a placeholder, a promise, a vow that she would not be forgotten. In the years following her identification, Dawn's story began inspiring conversations about prevention, victim support, and the importance of recognizing early warning signs in communities. Teachers, counselors, and community leaders used her case as an example of why communication matters, why young people need safe environments, and why no missing persons report should be dismissed or delayed. Dawn's case became more than a historical cold case. It became a reminder that each young life deserves protection, each disappearance deserves attention, and each unidentified person deserves to be named. Her story touched countless lives, those who knew her before she vanished, those who searched for her identity, and those who learned about her decades later through documentaries, news segments, and online true crime communities. And now, as we move deeper into this documentary, we explore the broader impact of her case on forensic innovation, the ethical questions surrounding genetic genealogy, and the lasting legacy of a girl who was lost for almost 40 years but never truly abandoned. Before we continue, remember that your engagement helps keep stories like Dawn's alive. If you haven't already, take a moment to like this video, leave a thoughtful comment, and hit the subscribe button. You are watching Disturbed Intent, where every untold story is brought into the light. Once Dawn Olanick's identity was finally confirmed, investigators found themselves returning to a question that had lingered unanswered for nearly 4 decades. How had a teenage girl from Long Island ended up in a secluded New Jersey cemetery? Understanding the truth required revisiting the earliest steps of the investigation, searching for threads that had once seemed insignificant but now carried new meaning. When police originally responded to the scene in that summer of 1982, they had little more than the physical evidence in front of them. The area where Dawn was found had no signs of personal items, no bag, no wallet, no official documents. Without these, investigators were forced to rely on clothing, hair samples, and the nature of the injuries to estimate who she might have been. But those clues, while informative, did not provide a name. Now, decades later, with modern forensic context, the same clues began offering a clearer picture. Detectives revisited the crime scene photographs, studying the location with a level of detail that had previously been impossible. The cemetery sat along a quiet stretch of road, surrounded by thick trees that offered both darkness and privacy. Whoever brought Dawn there had chosen a location that was isolated enough to conceal what happened, but public enough that she was almost guaranteed to be discovered eventually. This detail alone revealed something about the mindset of the person responsible. It was not an attempt to hide her forever, only long enough to avoid immediate detection. Understanding this helped narrow the behavioral profile investigators built around her killer. They began comparing the method, the location, and the timeline to known offenders active during that period. The 1980s were a turbulent era in many parts of the United States, with rising crime rates in several regions. But small towns like Blairstown still held on to a sense of security that made Dawn's discovery particularly shocking. It was not the kind of place where residents expected violence. It was not a location known for crime. That added weight to the suspicion that Dawn had not been killed by a local. The person responsible had likely traveled or passed through, using the rural cemetery as a temporary, secluded spot. As investigators continued their renewed work, they revisited old reports from the original days of the investigation. One detail stood out: the condition of Dawn's hands. Though we remain fully ad-safe and avoid graphic content, it was noted at the time that her nails had been manicured with clear polish. It was something subtle, but meaningful. It suggested she had taken care of herself shortly before her death. She was not living transiently or in unstable conditions. She was still maintaining the daily habits of a teenager. That detail, which had originally provided no clear direction, became significant once her identity was known. It aligned with who Dawn was, someone who cared about her appearance, who was still rooted in her teenage world. Detectives also began reconstructing her social circles. They created a map of where Dawn lived, where she went to school, who she interacted with, and what influences surrounded her. The 1980s were a vastly different era from today. Teenagers had more independence, fewer digital trails, and often found themselves in situations with little documentation. A teenager could disappear for a day or two without suspicion rising immediately. This lack of digital footprints made Dawn's movements during her final days difficult to retrace. Her world had been one of youthful exploration, early independence, and personal challenges. Like many teens, Dawn was navigating friendships, emotions, and conflicts. But nothing about her history suggested danger. And yet, somewhere along the way, she crossed paths with someone capable of extreme harm. This is where the deeper investigation into Arthur Kinella began to matter. Kinella had been the kind of individual whose name moved through law enforcement whispered rather than spoken loudly. He had a documented history of violence, as well as a documented history of drifting between regions. He was unpredictable, often unstable, and sometimes associated with individuals living on the margins of society. When investigators re-examined his historical records, they found geographic overlap with Dawn's disappearance period locations that would have made it possible for him to encounter her. It's important to emphasize that naming someone responsible in a cold case requires a foundation of evidence that can hold against scrutiny, even if prosecution is no longer possible. Investigators needed to be absolutely certain before they concluded that Kinella was responsible. The renewed look at the case, paired with Dawn's identity and previously overlooked statements, allowed them to reach that conclusion with confidence. Yet even as investigators pieced together what had happened, the emotion behind the case remained heavy. For years, Dawn had been buried under a name that was not hers. She had been mourned by a community that never knew her family. And her family had spent years not knowing where she was or what had happened to her. This disconnect between identity and reality made her case unique. She had lived in one world, lost in another, and been remembered in a third. Her identification allowed these worlds to finally converge. Investigators were able to provide Dawn's family with answers, and Blairstown residents, who had protected her memory for so long, could finally see her as a whole person. They had cared for her grave, visited her resting place, and honored her without ever knowing her name. When the truth came to light, it became clear that her story had touched far more lives than anyone realized. After Dawn was identified, conversations began about how her grave should be handled. Some felt that the name Princess Doe had become iconic, a symbol of hope and dignity. Others believed her true name should replace the placeholder, giving her the respect of genuine identity. Ultimately, the decision would reflect not just practicality, but sentiment. It was a moment that revealed the delicate balance between remembering who Dawn had been to the world and acknowledging who she truly was. Her case also sparked important discussions within the field of forensic science. Experts debated how unidentified remains should be managed, how DNA evidence should be preserved, and how the growing field of genealogy could be used responsibly. Dawn's case showed that even after 40 years, DNA could remain intact enough to reveal identity. This encouraged medical examiners and law enforcement departments across the country to re-examine old remains, understanding that even the smallest piece of evidence could hold the key to solving a mystery. As more departments began exploring genealogical databases, ethical questions emerged. How far should police go in analyzing genetic connections? How should privacy be protected? How could this powerful tool be used in a way that respected families and individuals? Dawn's case became a touchstone in these discussions, a real-world example of both the potential and responsibility of using advanced forensic tools. Beyond the scientific community, her story influenced everyday people as well. Individuals who had never been interested in true crime suddenly found themselves drawn to cold cases, wanting to understand how someone could remain unidentified for so long. Families with missing loved ones saw renewed hope in their own searches. People who had once believed that decades-old mysteries were beyond solving began to feel differently. At the center of all of this was Dawn, a young girl whose life had been taken far too soon, but whose story helped reshape the landscape of forensic investigation. She became a symbol of persistence, a reminder that forgotten cases can be revived and rewritten. Her identity proved that cold cases are not cold because they are unsolvable, but because they have not yet met the right combination of timing, technology, and determination. Investigators who had worked on her case through the years often spoke about how personal it felt. Even after retiring, many kept in contact with active detectives, asking periodically whether there had been progress. Some visited her grave on anniversaries of her discovery. Others kept copies of her sketch pinned to their office walls, a silent reminder of unfinished work. When the answer finally came, it was not just a professional victory, it was emotional closure. They had kept their promise. They had not allowed her to be forgotten, and in the end, they had delivered her back to her family with dignity. But as this documentary moves into its final part, the story reaches beyond Dawn herself. It reaches into the world she changed, the progress her case inspired, and the legacy she leaves behind. Her name, once lost in time, now stands as a testament to truth, perseverance, and the belief that every story deserves an ending. Before we continue, remember that these stories live on because you help amplify them. If you haven't already, take a moment to like this video, leave a thoughtful comment, and hit the subscribe button. You are watching Disturbed Intent, where the forgotten are never abandoned. As the truth about Dawn Olanick's identity settled into the public consciousness, a quiet shift began to take place, one that stretched far beyond the borders of New Jersey and Long Island. Her story, once suspended in the limbo of anonymity, now held the weight of a lesson that echoed through every corner of the forensic world. The power of her identification was not only in naming her or naming her killer, it was in the undeniable proof that time does not erase truth. Time only waits for someone willing to go back and look again. The final chapter of Dawn's story was not simply about closure. It was about what her case changed. It was about what her case strengthened, and it was about what her case taught us. Investigators, forensic genealogists, journalists, and everyday people who had followed her story for years found themselves reflecting on what her journey represented. For nearly 40 years, she had been known only by a name given to her by strangers who refused to let her fade away. Princess Doe, the girl with no identity, the girl whose face could not reveal her truth, the girl adopted by a town that loved her without ever meeting her. Now, her life had meaning in a new way. She had become a symbol of perseverance, and her identification stood as a reminder that silence can be broken even after decades. Her story had proven that the forgotten can be remembered, and that even the faintest traces of DNA can speak louder than time. In the months after her identity was announced, Dawn's family began processing the emotional weight of knowing what had happened to her. They had lived with a void for so many years spent wondering, imagining, searching, and hoping. They had experienced a kind of grief that never fully ends because it has no confirmed beginning. When they learned the truth, it reopened wounds they had once tried to heal, but it also closed an emotional chapter they had never been able to finish. They could finally mourn her with certainty. They could finally honor her with understanding. The conversation surrounding Dawn's legacy grew louder. Her case was added to educational materials for forensic students learning about genealogy. It became a point of reference for cold case analysts. Her identity was discussed in conferences focused on modern investigative techniques, highlighting the importance of preserving even the smallest fragment of evidence. A tooth, after all, had been the key to unraveling the mystery that had endured for almost 4 full decades. Her story also brought attention to the importance of properly documenting and reporting missing persons. Cases from the past often suffered from incomplete records, delays in reporting, or misunderstandings between jurisdictions. Dawn's case demonstrated how easily a person could slip through the cracks in an era before centralized databases. It reminded the world that every missing person deserves urgency, accuracy, and visibility. As media outlets revisited her case following her identification, people began to appreciate the long arc of work that had gone into finding the truth. Journalists interviewed retired detectives who had spent years staring at her case file, hoping for a break that never came during their active careers. They spoke with the forensic experts who handled the delicate extraction of her DNA. They spoke with genealogists who mapped her family tree, one distant relative at a time. And they spoke with the community members in Blairstown who had kept her memory alive through kindness, compassion, and the simple act of refusing to forget. For decades, Dawn had rested beneath a gravestone marked with a name that was both hers and not hers. Princess Doe was a title created to protect her dignity, but it was also a placeholder for a truth that had not yet been uncovered. When news of her identity reached the community that had cared for her, many felt a bittersweet mixture of relief and sorrow. They had always wanted her to have a name, but in giving her that name, they also had to let go of the title under which they had come to know her. Some people hoped her true name would replace Princess Doe on her gravestone. Others believed the original name should remain as a tribute to the decades of care the community had given her. Whatever the final decision, the sentiment behind it came from a place of respect. What mattered most was not the words on the stone, but the recognition that Dawn was no longer a mystery. She was finally home in the truth. Her case also sparked changes in how law enforcement agencies approached unidentified remains. Departments across the country began to reassess old cases with renewed urgency. Bodies that had once been archived without resolution were re-examined. In some places, medical examiners partnered with genealogical organizations to categorize unidentified remains and determine which cases were strong candidates for DNA extraction. Grants were created, funding was expanded, and new laboratory partnerships emerged. Dawn's story acted as a catalyst, encouraging a wave of reinvestigation across the United States. In many ways, Dawn stood at the intersection of past and present, her life shaped by an era where forensic tools were limited, and her identification shaped by an era where technology had evolved beyond what anyone in 1982 could have imagined. Her story illustrated not just personal tragedy, but human advancement. It highlighted the power of science, the value of persistence, and the importance of every individual life. As investigators spoke publicly about the case following its resolution, many remarked that Dawn's story had taught them to never underestimate the significance of time. A case that seems cold is not a case without answers. It is only a case waiting for the right moment, the right method, or the right person to unlock its truth. Dawn's case reminded law enforcement that persistence is sometimes the greatest investigative tool. When authorities officially named Arthur Kinella as the individual responsible for her death, it brought a measure of justice, though not the complete form that a courtroom trial might have provided. Kinella's life had followed a pattern of violence that ultimately connected him to Dawn, even if the details of their interaction could never be fully reconstructed. Naming him held symbolic weight. It acknowledged responsibility, it returned agency to Dawn, and it ensured that history would record not just her loss, but the person behind it. As the final strands of her story fell into place, Dawn's narrative became a beacon for families still waiting for answers in their own cases. Parents of missing teenagers, siblings of long-lost loved ones, communities who had adopted their own unidentified victims, they all felt a renewed sense of possibility. Dawn's identification proved that even after many years, answers do exist, and those answers can change everything. Her legacy lives not only in the truth of her name, but also in the change her case inspired. She became a symbol of hope, a testament to perseverance, and a reminder that every person deserves dignity in both life and death. Her story shows that forgotten cases are not forgotten because people stop caring, they are forgotten because people stop believing. Dawn's case reignited that belief. Now, as this documentary comes to a close, one final truth settles into place. Dawn's journey did not end in the summer of 1982. It continued through every detective who refused to give up, every forensic expert who handled her evidence with care, every community member who visited her grave, every online reader who shared her story, and every person listening now. She was never truly alone. She was never truly abandoned. She was always moving toward the moment when someone would finally say her real name aloud. Her story has been told. Her identity has been restored. Her truth has been carried out of the shadows. And her memory, now rooted in clarity rather than mystery, will not fade. If you have followed this story through all 5 parts, take a moment to support the channel that brings these cases to light. Make sure to like this video, leave a thoughtful comment, and hit the subscribe button. You are watching Disturbed Intent, where every forgotten voice is given the space to be heard, and every lost story is guided back into the light.